All right. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Jay Bigelow. I'm with CED. I'm excited to introduce you to our panel of experts today to talk about COVID-19, its impact on certainly life science, North Carolina, biotech, tech community, and I'm anxious to get them started. So I'll do a quick introduction, and then we'll go from there. First, Bill Hawkins. Bill Hawkins is a co-chair of our conference this year. He's the former chairman and CEO of Medtronic. He's a member of the Duke University Board of Trustees, serves on several committees. He's also chair of the board of Duke University Healthcare System. He's a director of public companies and private companies and works with numerous private equity investors. So knows the business side of healthcare in and out. Next, Mark McClellan, Dr. Mark McClellan. Mark is a physician and economist and currently the Robert J. Margolis Professor of Business Medicine and Policy at Duke University. He's a former administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and former commissioner of the FDA. Mark's worked to improve a wide range of strategies and policy reforms to advance healthcare, including payment reform to promote better outcomes and lower costs, method for development, use of real-world evidence, and strategies for more effective biomedical innovation. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Cameron Wolfe. Cameron is the leading Duke University's medical school Corona Task Force, and he's on the front lines treating COVID-19 patients and currently investigator in a phase 3 study for remdesivir, I never say that right, naturally recognized infectious disease expert. And on Monday, it was announced that he's appointed to lead the U.S. COVID-19 efforts to develop EC18, a COVID-19 therapeutic drug. So with that, I'd love to get started, and I'll sort of throw it out there to each of you. Sort of when did you hear about COVID, and what was your first experience, and where did it start for you? Bill?
Well, I first appreciated, the impact of COVID back in mid-February, early February. I happened to be on the board of Biogen, a large biotech up in Boston, and we had a board meeting, and the next week there was a scientific session where leaders from all over the world for Biogen came into Boston and had their meeting, and then just following the meeting, 50 out of the 177 people all came down with flu-like symptoms. Ultimately, many of those people, ended up having COVID. So, I mean, obviously COVID had been in the news prior to that, but I'm not sure that I really appreciated, just how contagious this virus was. So that certainly was, for me, a point when, I realized that we needed to take this very, very seriously and do the things that ultimately local, regional, and national leaders have suggested.
Cameron, Mark?
Yeah, I remember distinctly reading about it on an ID listserv that sort of circulates about clusters of unusual things that pop up around the world. And I remember sitting down on New Year's Eve, taking a peek at some pneumonias in China, wondering what this was all about, and assuming it would have been a Legionella or something simple. And I concede I was as wrong as I could be thinking at that point. And then, Duke has actually, I think for us, it sort of really started to strike home in mid-January when Duke was, it became far more visible to us that our relationship with Wuhan and our university in Kunshan in China was something we really needed to think very acutely about, given its locality sort of halfway between Wuhan and Shanghai. And we had students here at that stage. We have a large student body of Chinese nationals. And I think from that point forward, it became quite evident to me this was going to be something a little different. I don't know that I fully appreciated how different it would be here early on. I think sort of still in January and February, I had high hopes that seeing how well Singapore had wrapped their arms around their first few cases. Bangkok seemed to be having things under control. Even Japan and sort of little clusters elsewhere in East Asian jurisdictions, I thought were actually handled quite well at the time. So I honestly remained hopeful early on when we had travel restrictions here that maybe that would be effective enough to allow us here in the United States to only have sort of small clusters. But again, I think to Bill's point, the sort of infectivity here and capability of this virus existing on surfaces and as a fomite transmitted sort of touch virus probably evaded those early efforts.
And for me, I didn't read about this on New Year's Eve. I was doing other things, but did hear about the reports in early January. And I've had the opportunity to work on a lot of epidemics and public health emergencies. Unfortunately, as part of the policy background I've had at FDA and elsewhere. And one of my close colleagues in that work for a really long time has been Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the recent FDA commissioner. And I remember our talking back in January. He was concerned then that this could be a black swan health and economic event globally. And we'd worked previously together at FDA when I was commissioner on SARS and saw how that had gone in parts of Asia where it really was seriously impactful other public health emergencies and epidemics since. So with his help, we were tracking this, especially with his leadership from early to mid-January. And in February, I had an event scheduled. We do a lot of collaborative work with the National University of Singapore and the Singaporean health system that ended up being canceled because of concerns about the virus there. They were already in pretty intensive response mode by that time. And I think those kinds of events together gave us a sense that we really needed to gear up our work in this effort, still hoping for the best, that the travel restrictions and other steps would contain the pandemic. But we were ramping up and did our first report paper on this with Scott Gottlieb and me together around mid-March. And it's been a pretty intensive experience since then too, obviously.
Yeah. And maybe we'll start with Dr. Wolfe. We're seeing a lot of news this week about vaccines, and we're going to have a vaccine, and there's all this vaccine testing going on. What's the likelihood that we'll have a vaccine this year, or what's a realistic timeline?
I get my crystal ball here. And
Yes.
I don't know that this year seems realistic to me. I hope I'm wrong. Don't get me. There's clearly been an enormous effort focused really singularly on coming up with a vaccine here that has, to my knowledge, never been so unifiably directed worldwide at one thing. So, like, if there's optimism that effort could turn something in 2020, great. I don't know that we're quite there. I mean, obviously Moderna has early phase 1 data, but it's very small numbers. They, on the surface of what their press release showed, certainly did what we would have hoped, which is stimulate an antibody response comparable to what it looks like real infection recovery appears to be. But like we've probably talked about before with discussions of antibody testing, I don't think we know yet what those antibodies truly translate to in terms of protective efficacy. And that'll obviously be the next sort of phases of steps that they go into, is to say, look, let's expand our preliminary safety data. Let's continue to understand a little bit about what that vaccine-induced immune response really looks like in terms of its persistence and its protective capability. And that takes time. So, the developmental phases, where there's a few companies now that are sort of moving through early phase 1, phase 2 work, and that's as far as they've got. But it's in the right direction. I think the big question for me, which I find harder to predict, and I think brings in a lot of sort of geopolitics that Mark would probably be better versed with than me, is how do you go from a vaccine that in the lab and that in a group of study recipients works, And how do you translate that into a mass production effort that frankly needs to be global? I mean, I think a lot of the discussion so far here that I've perceived has been how do we get this in a purchased way for the United States? And that worries me that we would shoot ourselves in the foot if we did that for a global virus. And yet that brings in many more complicated questions of how do we increase mass production in a way that's meaningful for sort of global spread of a helpful vaccine. That's the more complicated question, and to me, why I can't see that coming to pass in 2020.
That's great lead in, Mark. I think, the scientists are working on the core science. Then there's a question of getting it through the approval process and getting manufactured and getting it out to people. Is there an opportunity to change the world and the way we do that, Mark? Or do you think we're going to have a different approach with this one, given the severity of it?
We are having a different approach, and I want to build on some of Cam's comments. And the challenge with vaccines is that they do take time to develop. You're using them in large populations, many healthy people. It's not like treating someone who has serious coronavirus complications in a hospital and you really need something right then to save their lives. So the tests need to include large numbers of people so we understand safety. And also it takes time for people to mount an immune response, and may even take 2 doses of some of these vaccines. So that's months for the trials. I think the really impressive thing that's going on now is that what has been a linear and often slow process with limited funding behind it. Remember, we were working on a vaccine for SARS, the last coronavirus, and that kind of petered out when the infection spread did. That's not the case this time. So it's an unprecedented amount of funding in this effort, as there should be, given the value of an effective vaccine or vaccines. And I think the good news is, first of all, it looks like people do mount real immune responses to this virus. We have lots and lots of people who are recovering because they've got neutralizing antibodies. It doesn't look like the virus is mutating that fast. It's not AIDS or something like that. So those are good foundations. And coupling that with the fact that we've got more technology to bring to bear on making vaccines, so not just the traditional kinds of vaccines based on using a virus vector or pieces of a kind of a modified virus, but also vaccines based on RNA and DNA, where you basically inject these substances and it kind of programs your own body to make a piece of the virus that you can have an immune response to. We don't know if all of these are going to work, but what I do think is going to happen is we're going to find out much more quickly than we have in any previous vaccine program, because the preclinical testing has a lot of backing. It's being done in the same time as it's sort of a seamless transition into the early stage, so-called phase 1 safety testing, and transition from that into studies to get kind of the doses right, make sure there is some kind of effect, and transition from that into the larger scale studies, all done with attention to the fact that we need to do these studies in areas where there actually is a significant outbreak of the vaccine. And the NIH, working with other global research and the FDA and regulatory agencies, are putting in place a structure to do that. And then the thing I want people to really take away that's different this time is what we're calling hyper parallel. So instead of having this long linear process, several things are happening at once. Most important, the vaccine manufacturing at large scale is already underway. And that may mean we throw away hundreds of millions or billions of doses of vaccines that at the end of that clinical development process don't actually work. But it also means that if there is success in the clinical testing, we won't have to wait before lots and lots of doses are available. I do want to emphasize, though, that means that a lot of people will potentially have access to a vaccine that's at least partially effective and safe much faster than usual, if any of these or some of these approaches really do work. We just don't know yet. The data are really early. I don't think you can infer that much. I apologize for the noise. Maybe we can pause this out.
It's a true Zoom call.
But I was just saying that we just don't know yet, based on the early data, whether there really is going to be a strong enough immune response and how many doses it's going to take and those kinds of things. From a global standpoint, though, every single step of this pandemic has been limited by the scale and the logistics of responding. We've known what we need to do at every stage, whether it's testing or getting ventilators to where they're needed or the like, but the scale of this effort is really unprecedented. And that's going to be a challenge, even if we make hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines. It'll be totally unprecedented this year. So they're ready to go late this year, next year, whenever we have the early compelling clinical results. Getting that to everyone around the world is going to be a big challenge. And I don't want to pretend that we've worked out those issues. I agree with Cam, that needs some more attention right now. The more we can build up manufacturing, I think it's well worth it. This is a matter of 10, 20, 30, $40 billion in a pandemic that's costing the U.S. economy $1 trillion a month, and the world economy much more. So we really need to ramp up these efforts.
Yeah, I just maybe make one comment there. I've been in the life science industry my whole career and been on this whole cycle of how do you bring a product to the market, the challenges of, from concept to product development to getting it through the regulatory agencies. And, my experience is that the toughest part is, not to undermine the challenges of that invention and innovation process, but the toughest part is actually getting it to the public and to the people who need it. And so I would agree with Mark. This is going to be a formidable challenge. It's the access. It's how once these vaccines are available and ramping up the manufacturing and being able to scale the manufacturing to be able to make billions of doses it's unprecedented. So I think it is encouraging to know that we're doing so much of this work in parallel, because if we had a vaccine available and we weren't then ready, it would be months, years before it would actually get to the people who need it. So I just want to stress the point that the whole access component of getting the vaccine, that when we have it, making sure that we're ready to be able to get it to all people who need it is probably going to be the biggest challenge that we have here.
It comes at a slightly different challenge for the United States, and I would argue Europe as it might for elsewhere, because we also have a vaccine confidence and perception issue here, which has grown over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Just think of measles issues. Like the audience here and this group, I think, will be well positioned to try and, as best as we can, stay ahead of that message. The logistics of convincing United States population that this will be well tested, safe, thoroughly evaluated, despite the speed of everything that Mark's talking about, is actually going to be quite a challenge that it would be worth us thinking about now. It'll be a different challenge in different parts of the world depending on vaccine skepticism, but I think it will not be an insignificant one. Very
cool. So we're going to have anticipate another wave of this in the fall. Not that I'm not too sure that we're through this first wave. Is that going to add a sense of urgency? Is that going to make things more complex? Is, sort of, again, going into your crystal ball, what's going to happen in the fall? It's going to either accelerate things or change things.
Well, I'll start on
Okay.
that one. I am still concerned about, before we even get to the fall, how we get through the next few months. We are reopening. The steps that many states are taking are in the right direction in terms of supporting businesses in reopening with much more distance, with masks, with checks, both symptom checks and increasingly testing. And we've got more testing widely available, other steps that can support safe reopening. And by the way, just a call out to CD for the work that CD has done on proposals and approaches to reopen safely, especially on the business side. I have the pleasure of working with some of the people at CED who helped put that together. And now is a time when we really need to be careful about those steps. We're still learning more about the virus. As Cam knows, it's can be very contagious. Hotspots and super spreader events have been a hallmark of the rapid spread of the virus so far. Hopefully, we're not only doing a better job of testing and of people and businesses doing physical distancing and other steps to contain spread, but we've got a better understanding of how these super spreader events occur in places like nursing homes or meatpacking plants or neighborhoods where people who don't have much resources are living closer together or using urban transportation. And hopefully that will get us through. But we need to be very vigilant just in the short term about upticks in hospitalization trends, things that are we observe with a lag on the infections. And if we're not careful, we could see significant outbreaks when they're really too late to control without taking some big steps back away from the careful economic reopening that we need right now. And on top of that, there is a real possibility of further waves in the fall. I think some of the epidemiologic forecasts are while not based in certainty, are very well founded. And that means another reason why we need to take further steps now to strengthen our ability to contain spread. So if we're lucky enough not to have any big outbreaks in the summer, that doesn't mean we're past this. It means we need to use that opportunity to help make sure we are reopening carefully and getting systems in place, places like Duke University, everywhere else, that will hold us in good stead if there is another outbreak in the fall. There's one other thing that I'd say would be helpful for a reason for some hope in avoiding big outbreaks in the fall, aside from the fact that we do have some time to prepare and figure out what really works in containment while we're going about some aspects of normalcy, is that there are other treatments that are in development now that could come forward and have an impact well ahead of the vaccine. So remdesivir, we mentioned earlier, antiviral that should be done with clinical testing within the next month, hopefully would be widely available if the clinical tests do come through as expected. Treatments based on antibodies that people develop themselves when they're convalescing, have recovered from the virus, and monoclonal versions of those treatments, as well as treatments for the most severe cases. What really gives this pandemic a tough edge is the minority of cases that result in serious hospitalizations, ventilation, and death. And if we can take some of that edge off, not only through especially protecting vulnerable populations going forward, but also through treatments that help reduce the severity of those tough cases, the fall could look different. More like a really bad flu season rather than something like what we've seen in the spring this year. But those are a lot of ifs. We got a lot of work to do in between now and then to prevent that big wave.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Mark. I think I approach the next 6 months with a little more optimism, and I think it's cautious optimism. It's optimism because I think, sorry, excuse my pager going off here in the background, zooming away. We certainly have done already a pretty great effort in terms of developing data on therapies. It's not perfect yet. I don't think remdesivir will be the panacea for folk, but I think, we'll build on that in the next coming months. I do take good heart from the fact that here in North Carolina, and frankly most states, I think are approaching reopening, as you described, in a very cautious and analytic way, and I hope a data-driven way. It always gives me pause that people think that they're sort of through a first wave and they did fine and this was not as bad as they perceived it to be, and therefore they ignore signal trends that reopening may trigger more little clusters. I think those clusters are likely to keep on coming. I don't know whether this will be a large second wave or a series of sort of high tide flows that sort of ebb and keep going over the next 6 months. I can't predict that. I will say that we did a tremendous effort, really nationwide, in closing ourselves down to mitigate and buy us time. I don't know that would be so straightforward to do that again if we ever had to. I think appetite for another closure of the same magnitude would be decidedly reduced in the community, for want of a better phrase. So I do think the approach to do this very cautiously is the right one, because I would hate to get the same sort of issues that beset New York to reappear again in the late, the summer or spring or fall. I think that would be a much more challenging effort to convince people to come back into a sort of a lockdown setting a second time. But I'm hopeful that that won't be the case. I think therapeutics will improve. I think the efforts towards better treatment structures, and frankly, even just better ways that hospitals have arranged themselves, predicting that this will continue. I mean, there are many things that we've learned there in terms of how to manage pandemic viral patients as they come in that are not going to be turned off for us in the hospital or on the university side. Well, frankly, I hope throughout much of the community. So provided that we recognize that reopening will not be to a point where it looks like 2019, then I think we'll be okay.
It's interesting. I sit on several boards and also on the board of trustees of the Duke University, and the number of conversations I've been in terms of trying to think about how we are going to reopen, if you will, or get businesses sort of back more, not obviously in full speed, but how do we kind of re-engage the businesses? And notwithstanding the fact that we all hope that there's going to be a therapy or better testing or at some point a vaccine. I mean, but the complexity of, I think, the reopening dwarfs, I think, what we went through and kind of shutting things down. I mean, we're going to face a lot of challenges to ensure that people, do take this, this seriously, given the fact that maybe we're starting to see some of the numbers, plateau and maybe come down in some areas. But I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us to ensure that we don't, see these hotspots come back in front of us. But, for example, at Duke, we've had numbers of recent board calls to talk about what we're going to do this fall, and we haven't made any final decisions. But I mean, what we do know is that it will be a different experience. And, we're doing the math around, what is space that you need to have around students if we were to have classes. I mean, looking at, the dorms and determining whether or not, we will just have one person per dorm, or, how many, looking at the bathrooms and, how many, facilities there are per person. I mean, there's just a lot of complexity that's going into the calculation of how do we ensure that as we open or we begin, to kind of get people back, how we're going to do that. And it's going to be a challenge, and we'll figure it out. But it's going to be very different, to your point, than what we experienced in 2019.
There's also a reality in what the three of us have just said, though, is that we all expect there to be ongoing cases, and we anticipate that there will be cases, and that's okay. I'm not sure that message is completely sinking into all elements of the community. That we're not going to be COVID free. That's got to be a reality.
That's actually a great lead in. One of our entrepreneurs asked us to ask the question about, reopening suggests like going back to what we used to do. And, maybe because of this, there's an opportunity to rethink the way people work or rethink the way universities operate. Any crystal ball predictions or ideas around just changing altogether as a result of this, either how businesses operate or thoughts, ideas?
I can make a couple comments here. I mean, absolutely. I mean, if I start on what's happening on the public education and the university side, I mean, I think there's a lot of thought going into how do we reimagine education and, gain from the experience that we've had, in the last 6 months and what we're going through now. And my sense is that, we will see a lot more, if you will, online education interspersed, with, person-to-person experiences. But we definitely will see more online. And the same thing, and I'm sure Mark and Cameron can will say the same thing in terms of healthcare. I mean, the experience that we've had in the last several months with telemedicine, and a lot of people, were maybe intimidated by it or just didn't have that opportunity or experience. And now that it's been sort of imposed upon them, I think people are realizing this isn't so bad. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of business model changes in healthcare and education and even in businesses. I mean, the businesses that I'm involved with, notwithstanding the fact that everybody has been working at home, most of these businesses are performing. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that the markets have shrunk a little bit, are doing well. I mean, we're being able to manufacture products. We're the whole sort of innovation engine continues to go forward. We're finding ways to interact with the clinical community and our customers, through online Zooming and everything else. And so I think you're going to see, as an outcome of this, a re-engineering and a reimagination of a number of different, businesses, education, and healthcare.
Just to add on to some of Bill's comments, reopening isn't the right term. I wish I had a good one-word summary for what is, but hopefully what we're going to see is a resilient economy, one that doesn't just come back, but comes back in many ways stronger than it was before. I think Bill's points about business experiences changing, workplace changing, more reliance on work that can be done from home, and more attention to the health and well-being of employees as part of that is going to be really important. And that's not only during this short-term, hopefully, phase, while we need to pay close attention, the fact that, as Cameron said, the virus is all around us, but also for the longer term, and not just to prevent future outbreaks, but because people have learned about maybe better ways, more convenient, more efficient ways to work. And would add something else about for the larger businesses, including some of the CED members, people are rethinking supply chains too. And back to the main point about the pandemic, is that getting supplies, who would have thought when they designed, nobody did, when they were designing the strategic national stockpile for the next pandemic, that what we really needed in there was masks and personal protective equipment and swabs, cotton swabs. So there are a lot of steps being taken now in healthcare and in other fields to have more robust supply chains, maybe to have a bit more domestic or closely located, reliable production too. I think that's going to be with us for a while as well. With respect to healthcare, this is an industry that has seen, as Bill said, some tremendous changes in the last 8 weeks, with more shifts towards telemedicine and home-based care during these 2 months than happened in the previous 20 years. And that's while many other industries were moving, much away from bricks and mortar into more consumer centricity. I think an open question still, and one where business leaders will have a role to play, since they're so important in the health and health insurance and healthcare of their employees, is how much of that really sticks. So we've seen a lot of adaptation to deliver visits that previously been done in the office by telemedicine. I'm not sure, because so many healthcare organizations have been hard hit in this pandemic. They depended on those fee-for-service, not only office visits, but surgical procedures, imaging procedures, testing, and for various clinical conditions and so forth on a fee-for-service basis, that a lot of them are feeling like they've just got to struggle to get through the next 12, 18 months, whatever it takes, between the continued impact of the pandemic and the economic tough times that seem very likely to be ahead for a while, and then go back towards the old normal. I hope that's not the case, but to really make these new care models stick, it takes more than just doing telemedicine visits. It takes some actual significant new investment in designing whole care processes around people, maybe doing their whole pre-op at home, or with a visiting nurse that comes in, or someplace more convenient and less risky in the community. It means thinking about ways of avoiding the surgical procedures in the first place. Could we replace more of those back pain surgical procedures with a home-based or community-based physical therapy and pain management program? I mean, they exist. They just haven't been, it takes investment to get these new structures in place. So I think we've got some tough issues ahead around how do we support healthcare organizations in making these longer-term changes, while they're facing some really difficult financial times right now. And maybe there's some ways to get there by, taking some steps now to move away from the fee-for-service payments, to give healthcare organizations more support in working with businesses to keep employees well at home, support telehealth and workplace activities there, working with public health departments in doing testing and tracing. Duke is doing a lot of this, as Cam said, but they're not really getting paid for it very well. It makes it hard to sustain and hard to build a whole program around it. Those are steps that we haven't taken yet as we think about what is a really resilient approach to recovery, rather than one that just tries to hold on for a while and go back to the old normal.
I mean, we've tried to tell our healthcare settings, and I suspect this translates well into the lab setting and therefore into a broader business community. Number one, we've gone through the first phase, which is technologically ramp up to make it capable to work over the last 2 or 3 months. And as Bill, as you said, lots of companies have continued to tick along quite effectively. That I feel like has been successful. Number two, though, is from a physician point of view, is a really careful analytic look back over the last couple of months to say which of those decisions thrust upon us remained medically sound, or which of those did we, at the end of the day, lose ground on basic healthcare because of the distance and the sort of telechoices put in front of us. Actually, I think a lot of them did not lose too much ground through careful physician and sort of healthcare thought at the time. But there will be, and frankly, some of them actually will turn out probably better. Like, I don't know why someone has to drive 10 hours to come and see me when I can do it on telemedicine. That just doesn't make any sense in retrospect. The third is what you talk about, is once you know you have some good technology in place to make it happen, once you've had a good look and say, well, which of these changes work, which are better, and which do I really medically need to go back to my original plans for? The third is the health economics and making that tick in a larger picture, and that's much more complicated. But we use those three models when we told our labs to say, right, you've had to crunch down in a rapid way. Now you've got to look at what you were able to do still by distance, pick apart the bits that worked for you, reinvent your reopening in a way, reinvigorate your reopening, if you want to try and think of a different word, to make it work where the central core of your opening up is the continued minimization of infection risk within your space. And then the economics of the lab or the economics of the business will have to come third once we figure the first two bits out.
It's interesting, Mark, your comments about what's going to take, for sort of this new way of doing things is going to take hold. And again, a big part of it is going to be, how are you going to get paid, and the whole reimbursement model has got to change. But the opportunities here are pretty significant. I mean, if you look at the P&L of a healthcare medical technology company or biotech company, the largest expense is if you will, the sales and the marketing expense. And if we have a way of maybe reducing the number of people that have to actually go in physically and sell a product and be able to use online techniques or whatever, I think we can take the cost out of the supply chain and redistribute healthcare dollars in a more productive way. So there's a lot of potential benefits that we can derive if we're able to take advantage of, what's happened and make sure that, we do support, this new way of managing businesses, through telemedicine or through online or digital health, et cetera, et cetera. So I remain optimistic that we have an opportunity here, to do some things that are going to improve, the way we do business and ultimately help us to take some cost out and be able to address, one of the biggest issues that we've all, been dealing with for years, and that's the rising cost of healthcare.
That's awesome. I know we want to wrap up here in a minute. I guess I'll give each of you a chance if there's one thing you'd like to leave the audience with. Just go around and share your thoughts. The last conversation was fascinating, but maybe there's something you're hoping for or an innovation you still want to see.
Well, I hate to use an overused sort of cliche, but never waste a good crisis. I think we have an opportunity here to reimagine, re-engineer, rethink, and ultimately improve, how we do things. And I think the other thing that's encouraging is just how, this crisis, has galvanized and really brought together, so many people to show what we can do, as a nation, as a global community to address, these formidable challenges. So I guess my thought is don't waste this opportunity.
I'd agree with that, and I'd back up off your global sort of linkages comment with one of my hopes out of my light just went out. Sorry, one of my hopes with all of this is that those very sort of preliminary surveillance systems that we've had set up internationally to help us find these events when they just first appear as their sentinel events can be really strengthened. Because I think there's so much opportunity that we could have had in the first few months of this to recognize the extent of how much it would spread and what that would mean. I think we can do better in that regard. So any sort of collaborative global help that will come out of this to observe for the next episode that comes would be a real gain.
We've been through a lot in the last few months, and I think one thing that Americans and people around the world are taking away from this is that we never want to see something like this happen again. And it's been interesting to see the responses in places like Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong that were hard hit by SARS and previous pandemics. So we know that it is possible to put in place better systems. For the United States, for other countries, the exact mechanism for doing that is going to be different. We have a federal system here, so it's not just one, centralized management. It's centralized support for local and state management across a very diverse country. And I certainly hope we don't lose sight of that. I think there's going to be strong support for taking more steps to avoid these kinds of this kind of pandemic in the future. But it's important to keep in mind that this is all going to be happening. These very big opportunities we have to build on what's worked and get to a more resilient economy, healthcare system, better health for Americans against the very difficult backdrop of tough economic times and some real pressures that are increasing health and economic disparities in outcomes. So this is not going to be easy to do, but there are clear steps that we can take to improve healthcare systems, to make education and other programs, social programs work better. We've learned a lot in these last few months, and with especially business leadership committed to following through on these reforms, I'm pretty optimistic about where we can come out in the future. It is some hard work ahead, though, to go from just kind of waiting this out and hoping we can open up and hoping we can somehow eventually recover, to being very resilient around our capabilities for better population health, not only when it comes to pandemics, but when it comes to other health risks that we're facing, more affordable health care, and better and more productive workplace environments as a result.
Bill and Mark and Cameron, thank you very much for joining us. There's about 500 more questions I'd like to ask, but I think as a Zoom call hits its 45-minute mark, that's probably about it. So maybe we can pick this up and do it again soon. I just want to thank you again for joining us and sharing your points of view.
Great to talk with you all.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of fun.